exact date, but do recall the first time I was exposed to the idea of summoning. It wasn't called that back then, but it was back in the early 90s, and there was this colorful character who called himself the Prophet Yahweh, who claimed that he could call in UFOs just by concentrating on the sky. There were several news stories about him in Southern California and even here in Southern Nevada, where he did manage to get these odd objects to appear above him, and even were caught on camera for the news crews. And he reached out to me a few times, because I was the UFO guy back then, and now, I guess, but each time that he reached out to me to set something up, I agreed to meet with him, but he didn't show up. So many years later, I started hearing more about organized efforts to do the same kind of thing, and it was called CE5, much fancier name, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind, and there were groups that were charging people, sometimes thousands of dollars, to attend these summoning parties in the desert or out in the woods somewhere, and my general impression is that it sounded a little bit, I don't know, smarmy, I guess. And then, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the New York Times did this story in 2018, and it turned out that 3 of the people who were in this group profiled by the New York Times were people I knew or I knew of, who were friends of my colleague Jeremy Corbell, the filmmaker. For the record, Jeremy did not talk them into doing this stuff. One of the people who was in that article is Jim Martin, who is a producer of paranormal films, head of paranormal films at 1091, which is a major distributor of content to places like Netflix and Prime and all the streaming services. And in that role, Jim has had direct hands-on experience in putting together and putting out some of the biggest UFO and paranormal films of all time, titles that most of you would recognize immediately. He doesn't just follow this stuff at work, though. He jumped in with both feet. He is an avid sky watcher, and I guess we call it a summoner. He's been directly involved in trying to get the rest of the world to better understand an ability that he believes is in all of us. Jim Martin, I can't believe it, but this is your first time on Coast. Welcome.
George, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really appreciate that generous intro.
I'm looking forward to having this conversation on the air for a long time, the kind of one that you and I have had off the air. So let's get right to it. You are not a guy who leaves this stuff at the office. You walk the walk and talk the talk. How did you jump into this process, and do you call it summoning?
Well, that's true. I'm a 24/7 UFO researcher and a film distributor of the same genre, so I'm definitely immersed in the subject. I've been interested in it since I was a kid. I had a really strange missing time experience in high school, and then later on in life, I learned of these, summoning simplified protocols and sought out some of these groups locally, which were holding this event.
So the first time, do you remember who talked you into how to do it?
Well, I actually, the first time I heard about this was in Dr. Greer's movie Sirius, and I saw the concept of using your mind to make contact, and I'd never heard of that before, but it was actually a local legend in Los Angeles, a guy named Robert Bingham, about a decade ago, who was holding these really profound events in LA where, groups of 20 to 50 people would get together and phenomenal recordings were taking place. So I actually sought out Robert, and he taught me how to do this firsthand, among many others, and then we kind of carried on these practices over the last decade and kind of splintered off into new groups.
Is he still around? Is he still doing it?
Robert is still around, of course. He's the originator of it. He works in Hollywood as a security guard. But he taught so many people how to do this, and it really spread wildly back in 2012 up to now.
How many people are out there doing this in LA and elsewhere?
In LA, easily hundreds of people, maybe if not thousands. I think worldwide it is probably tens of thousands of people at this point, especially with the release of CE5, which covers this topic in a documentary.
So you helped release those films you just mentioned, and you decided to follow it up by trying it yourself. Did it work the first time you tried?
You know what? The first time I tried, I went to a public event in 2012, and I witnessed phenomenon with my own eyes in person. Then when I got back to my house later that day, I had a really great sighting of an orb that came right over my apartment, which I filmed. And that was the first experience down this very unusual road.
Were you wary at all about this because of some perceptions that it might be nonsense or sounded like a scam, like a moneymaker?
For sure, I was skeptical at first, even though when I first learned of this, I didn't even know that these people were paying to go do this. I had just heard of it in the movie, and then I saw Robert, who was doing free events all over Los Angeles. I was skeptical at first, but when I showed up there at that event, I saw multiple objects performing different maneuvers in the sky that were unconventional, and I was convinced. And then later that day, when I got back to my house, I really wanted to record footage of this event, but I had such a poor camera back then, I couldn't capture any of the objects. When I got back home that day, I saw a big yellow orb that came in very close and allowed me to get footage of it. And that really changed my perspective from there on.
It allowed you to get footage. You think it has consciousness, that you're actually establishing some kind of contact.
I do believe that they are intelligently controlled, and I do believe that they can connect to our consciousness. And it's very interesting because I left that event that day very frustrated that I hadn't recorded any footage. And I got home and I was vexed about it. And then I had this great sighting, and it allowed me to record it. And I studied that footage, and that kind of solidified my belief in this phenomenon.
Had you heard of Prophet Yahweh? Or you now? By now you have, yeah.
Of course, he's one of the originators. I give him a lot of credit for going on national news and summoning an object on command. I think that takes great courage, and I'm certainly well aware of it.
Let's talk about that New York Times story, how that came about, and you had to be suspicious that this was a setup, that they were going to crush you, weren't you?
For sure. We were very skeptical of the reporter, although she was super sweet, a woman named Rosette Ragu, and she spent many months with us. But after I met her, our guard started to go down. She really immersed herself in our little group. She went to numerous events, a couple private hangouts, and we produced phenomenon in front of her. And so we came to trust her, although we still were very worried that when the piece came out, it would be highly critical or roast our group. But it was surprisingly a favorable article in the kind of subculture section of the New York Times.
Yeah, it was shocking that they played it right down the middle. I suspect that she must have sort of like implanted herself with your group over a period of time. But did she ever accomplish it herself? Was she just a bystander, or did she give it a go?
That's a great question. I don't know if she tried the protocols on her own, but she certainly witnessed a lot of phenomenon with us in the group, and she did take part, I would say, in these protocols of sending out a thought and then having a response in the sky. So I think the more we got to know her, the more we felt her intentions were sincere, and we were very pleased with the outcome.
At this point, how long have you been doing it, and how many times do you think it's worked, percentage-wise?
I've been recording about 12 years now. I've recorded hundreds of UFOs at this point. I'd say 40 of my recordings are really stellar, undisputable recordings, and it depends, the ratio of success, on really where you're doing it. If I'm at my home or my office where I see phenomenon a lot, an area, a window of activity, essentially, I can have pretty good odds to generate phenomenon, at least 50% or more. It's when I go to a new territory that I typically have to ground myself and take a few weeks to achieve the same result.
So walk me through it. How does it work?
Yeah.
The first time somebody out there wants to try it, what do they do?
Well, it's very simple. It's very simple. You don't need a guru or there's no religious beliefs you have to pay for. You simply just go outside, you stare very intensely at one point in the sky, and you channel this profound gratitude. And you kind of harness that feeling, and you send out your thoughts to make contact, to please appear, show me the truth. It's as simple as that. And then you pull back, you wait a few minutes, and typically the phenomenon will reveal itself.
A few minutes, meaning 10, 15, 30?
Sometimes it's as instantaneous as we'll show up at a place, and the phenomenon will show up even before we've done the protocols. Other times we'll do it, it'll take 20 minutes or 30 minutes. It really depends on the energy of the group, the coherence of the group, and the location.
You don't have to have a group, though. You did it by yourself.
Yeah, all my best recordings have mostly been shot by myself, although I've had some amazing recordings with the group in Los Angeles as well.
So tell us what these things are. You just focus on the sky, you express gratitude, and you wait for something to show up, and it tends to generally work. But what are these things? Because I've seen the images. We can talk about how the audience can see it too, but I've seen your images day and night. Some of them are, just orb-like things. Some of them are pretty complicated, morphing into different shapes. Some of that nighttime stuff is spectacular. So tell us what you think they are, and explain and detail some of the things that you've recorded.
Well, what they are is still a major mystery to me. Unfortunately, the longer I've recorded them, the less I know what they are. I really kind of lumped it down to two basic types of UFOs at this point. I feel that there are machine UFOs, which are likely engineered, maybe using alien hardware. I think that's more of a rare type of sighting. And then there's the second category, which I believe are biological UFOs, living creatures in our upper atmosphere, which are likely outside of our visible light spectrum. And I think that biological UFOs tend to account for the majority of the civilian sightings. And certainly I believe what I am contacting appears to be something natural, a natural force, whether of nature or of another intelligence.
So describe some of the best videos you have. There's one that's shot at night that I've seen, and it looks like a giant octopus or something dropping little baby octopi. You know which one I mean?
Yeah, it looks like it's a night recording, but it's actually a daylight recording at 2 p.m. It was shot with infrared, so it turns the sky gray. But that was actually a sighting in Long Beach of a large, what appeared to be some kind of plasma structure, and it released about 50 smaller orbs right over my house. And it was a very, very interesting sighting. For one, the first formation that came out of the project was a triangular formation of these orbs. So that's a commonality for me. I saw many sightings that form triangle formations, so that's kind of a visual cue for me to them that we are interacting with each other. And then beyond that, it released another 45 objects or more into the sky. And the last fascinating point is I could only see these smaller objects with my infrared camera. I could not see them with the visible eye.
So they could be up there all the time. We're just not able to see them.
I think that's correct. I just switched recording infrared about 4 years ago, and it changed my entire perspective on filming UFOs. The first part of my career was all visible light, and that led to some exceptional findings. But once I started recording in infrared, there's just so much up in the sky that we can't see with our normal range of light that the infrared camera reveals. And I'm not the first one to do this. You look at all the government recordings, they're all in infrared. But beyond that, even in the 50s and 60s, you had Trevor Constable, who really pioneered this work of capturing amoeba-type creatures in the infrared spectrum. So it's long been practiced.
You must see things. I've seen some of the videos that look like, and I've seen these things myself in videos shot here in Las Vegas of things that move around. They look like maybe they're big plastic bags or something because they're morphing and changing shapes and moving kind of with the wind. Could be plastic bags, could be balloons, weather balloons, something like that. I take it that you and your group try to be skeptical about these things.
Certainly, super skeptical. We try and use as much discernment as possible. I've been doing this for a while, analyzing footage, at least in my little career, 10 years recording them, and I tend to try and present the recordings that I think speak for themselves. But certainly a lot of these sightings can be attributed to conventional objects, weather balloons, birds, etc.
We're going to bring on two guys who were friends of yours, but were highly skeptical, gave you a lot of grief about this, but you turned them around. You challenged them to come out and give it a try and to change their views. We'll bring them on in the top of the hour. Might open up the phone lines with some questions from our audience for you before we bring those guys on. We go into the break with Jackie Wilson, Higher and Higher.